if you believe that the current system, has been perverted by these mechanisms, that our democracy is suffering from, the network effects of these large corporations, again, I would encourage you to look at Bitcoin, because you can arguably say that Bitcoin does not operate that way. Satoshi Nakamoto, the founder of Bitcoin, had no, has no founding stake. There's no startup. There's no equity that he has in Bitcoin Corporation. To the extent that he owns Bitcoin, he got them through the same process that everyone else did of burning energy and then, collecting the issuance of Bitcoin. And because of that, the value accrual in Bitcoin is fundamentally different, right? So again, to the extent that the left is interested in new structures of power, I think they should be really interested in Bitcoin.
Welcome to the Progressive Bitcoiner podcast, where we explore the intersection of Bitcoin and progressive issues. I'm your host, Mark Stefani. My guest today is Pete Rizzo. Over the course of his 13 years reporting on Bitcoin, he has become one of the most widely read and respected voices in the space. We cover a variety of topics, but primarily focus on what rights Bitcoin grants its users and how it distinguishes itself from other cryptocurrencies. It was a great joy to record this podcast with Pete. I know you will appreciate his keen insights on Bitcoin. Thank you so much for tuning in. All right. Pete Rizzo, thank you so much for joining me on the Progressive Bitcoiner podcast. I'm so happy to have you.
Awesome to be here.
Welcome back from the conference.
Yeah, it was a wild time. Looking forward to welcoming people who didn't join the Bitcoin 2023. Tickets on sale now, and hard to surpass the feeling of being at the biggest event in the year. Definitely, it's been quite the come down over the last couple of days.
Undoubtedly. Well, we've got a lot to get through, and before we get into the heart of the discussion, which I want to focus on with regard to the ethical argument for Bitcoin, one of your pieces in Forbes not too long ago, I just want a few general questions directed towards you, since you've got such an incredible expertise and breadth of knowledge within the space. And first and foremost, I'm really kind of curious to know why you have chosen to focus your career on reporting on Bitcoin.
Yeah, interesting question. Definitely changed a lot over time. So, a little bit about me: editor for Bitcoin Magazine, editor at large for Kraken, and a contributor over at Forbes Crypto. I started writing about Bitcoin in 2013. And I think at first the answer to that question would have been just because it was a great story, right? When Bitcoin kind of emerged, it was this, kind of confusing phenomenon. People were using the strange, internet currency to make transactions, and no one quite understood it. But it was very exciting, right? And there was all sorts of different people from different walks of life joining it, from small merchants to kind of big venture capitalists. And it was sort of an interesting story because, people from all sorts of walks of life were diverging on this, thing that we couldn't really quite explain or comprehend, but we knew that was very different from existing kind of payment solutions and monetary solutions at the time. I think as I've gone on in the industry, that's definitely changed. So, my answer today, I think, would be the reason that I continue doing work as a journalist or researcher or historian. There's definitely people who describe my work in different ways, is to, one, I think, get across the tremendous amount of kind of knowledge that has existed in the space, right? I think when we have these cycles in Bitcoin where the price rises and new people come in, it can be hard for them to digest the kind of breadth of things that have happened, right? So that sort of creates this phenomenon where new people come in and they have these ideas, and these ideas may be things that have already happened in Bitcoin and been discussed and discarded, and it makes it hard for them to be active contributors. So I think newer people to the industry often struggle to know how to contribute because in many ways it's sort of like walking in the middle of a movie that has kind of been going on and has been very complex. So there may be decisions that happened or conversations that sort of give the answer to what you're looking for, but they're very obscure, right? So they happen in sort of an era of Bitcoin with people in Bitcoin who are no longer really around. And sort of, I see my work as sort of existing to surface that, right? It's to try to get rid of this brain drain effect that we have in Bitcoin where, it is just very hard to get your head around just how much has happened, who has been important to Bitcoin, what specifically do they contribute and why they are important, and then using that information to move forward in some way. And certainly there are people who have, found a path for that that's a bit accelerated. But I think to the average person, that can be a bit confusing because, brain drain happens at all parts in the system. And one of the parts of the system that's most pervasive is in the journalism sector, right? Where you have a really heavy rotation of people who are writing about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. And so then your knowledge loss is really not just happening in the industry itself, it's happening in the people who cover the industry. So the people who are covering the industry are covering it as if it's new, and the people in the industry are treating it as if it's new. And there's sort of this hybrid problem where, it can seem like in the mainstream news cycles that we're not making that much progress on the theoretical side of understanding Bitcoin, when in reality, that's not the case. There is meaningful progress being made there. It's that just, one, it's hard for that information to disseminate itself. And then the systems by which information is disseminated don't have the right incentives to disseminate that information. So there's multiple layers to that problem. And I think I see that problem as being, something that is really important for the industry to solve, because if we can't scale our accumulated knowledge, I think we're going to be in a rut where we're, repeating a lot of the same work, mistakes, schisms, debates, arguments, etc.
When you were first writing about Bitcoin in the early years, you received a lot of criticism for quote things that you got wrong. What allowed you to eventually take that feedback and do more research on Bitcoin rather than digging in your heels into why you were right and the Bitcoiners were wrong?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the answer to that question is that, and I think this is really another thing that drives my work, is it's very easy for people who are doing a job to think that they're doing their job well. So I always go back and say, look, I was part of the founding team at CoinDesk. I helped scale that to be an international organization, with 60 reporters working around the globe. And, by the definitions of the job, I did that job well, right? I scaled the cryptocurrency journalism side of the ecosystem. I increased the amount of articles that were being produced and I created this sort of journalistic center for the industry that did not have that. So it is possible for that to be good and value add, but for that system to then exist outside of the knowledge accrual in the industry, which is sort of the problem that I was kind of talking about. So when I look back at my early work, I find that in my quest to be objective, I pursued objectivity within the lens of the discussion, sort of assuming that all of the participants that I was speaking with were more knowledgeable than me and then more correct or intellectually valid in their assumptions. So this sort of metastasized in the period of Bitcoin history known as the fork wars, where different parts of the ecosystem developed different entrenched psychologies about how Bitcoin functioned, became really militant about that, and then ultimately sort of came to some sort of climactic conclusion where they sort of battled that out. And so my first attempt at grappling that was to treat it objectively, right? To assume that both sides were being upfront or had legitimate claims to their stance. But in reality, that wasn't the case, right? In reality, a certain group of those people did have more expertise. They did have more of an understanding, and they had made more of an attempt to grapple with some of the underlying theoretical parts of Bitcoin that are more interesting or unique. And I think that over time, I've crossed over into seeing that group as being correct. But partly that was because I actually did the research of going back through the old forums, understanding where Bitcoin came from, and really doing my own research. I think it's hard for newer people, I think, to understand that in 2013, 2014, it may seem like it was very early, but there was this tremendous sense that Bitcoin was happening, that it had happened, and that it had become mainstream, right? In 2013, 2014, the price of a Bitcoin had gone to $1,000. You had major mainstream coverage at nearly every large media entity. The New York Times, sort of had a Bitcoin beat, the Wall Street Journal. And in many ways, media saturation at that time was much higher than it was today. So Bitcoin was hitting $1,000, and these big companies like Coinbase and BitPay were ascendant and positioning themselves as the next Googles and Apples and what have you. You had this idea that Bitcoin had happened, that the people who had made money maybe had made all the money that that could have possibly made on Bitcoin, and this was just going to become a slowly more mainstream thing. And certainly a lot of venture capitalists did, take that position. But, I think that as we look back, it's actually really, it's hard to see things that way, right? There is the understanding that we got things wrong, that era, produced an understanding of a Bitcoin that was incomplete or is today dated. And I think it can be hard for us to see our own time as having the same problems, right? And I think as I look at the 2021, 2020 sort of, price activity within Bitcoin, right, there's this tremendous, impetus to assume that we have this new understanding that the narratives that we've added to Bitcoin are more correct, and I don't think that's the case. Partly because, again, just like sitting through this information over time, and looking at it takes a long time to, I think, put Bitcoin in context, right? And I'll give you just a small example before I wrap this one up. But just early on in Bitcoin, one of the things that I find fascinating is for the first year, it just didn't have a price, and that's something that your relationship to that information is going to be different than if I say it to you that Bitcoin did not have a price and that the market, monetized Bitcoin like spontaneously. To you, just like digging through forum logs for a year and then seeing that for a year, everyone lived every day like in a reality where Bitcoin had no price. And then at some point, Bitcoin had a price because people decided to create markets and exchanges, and that happened outside of its creator. That was a spontaneous market formation event. So it's one thing to hear a piece of information, and then I think it's another thing to try to put yourself in the shoes of the people who would have experienced that information as it occurred. And it is specifically that second thing that I have tried to do, because I think unless you make the leap to trying to get to that second thing, to really kind of give yourself the relational context of that information, it can be very easy to dismiss information or treat it as insignificant, right? So when I look back and I look at this first period of Bitcoin history, I can say, not only is this amazing within the history of data, that data spontaneously became money, but we know now that this really hasn't happened for any of the other cryptocurrencies. They don't go through this process, right? They go through a process where they are pre-allocated to venture capitalists who, decide that they have some value, and then they're sold to the public. First the private market, then the public. But that's a tremendously different process. So whether you're to argue that necessitates the application of the United States security laws or global security laws can be a whole separate conversation, but we can at least start with the recognition that these are two different things. And I think that's, one of the things that my work has helped try to contextualize for people.
I do want to contrast your experience, though, with what may seem to be a more prevalent position for some journalists in the space at this time. You changed your position. You were criticized for getting things wrong, but now you've devoted your career to this thing that you were initially criticized for getting wrong. You see perhaps the opposite situation currently, where an article will come out in the New York Times or something, and it gets a lot of things wrong. And we all see that particular journalist or the New York Times will double down on that perhaps misinformation. You did not. You changed. You did more research. What was that about you that allowed you to do that? Is that perhaps a specific part of your personality or not?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't think that I'm particularly special, but I struggle to also find examples of other journalists who made that leap. I think it comes down to the fact that there are just some basic psychologies around money, right? And I think that Bitcoin is so revolutionary in its intent. It's very easy to write it off, right? And it's very easy to so for me, it's very confusing, like how Nathaniel Popper, who spent so much time in Bitcoin, has gone on to write about something like Wall Street Bets, which I think is just like within the arc of history, just a very unimportant phenomenon that has absolutely no consequence on not only the development in the United States, but like the US public markets or the globe, right? I think ultimately his decision to focus on that work will just be insignificant. And he obviously thinks differently. Otherwise, he would not pursue the writing of that information. So again, I think it comes from the fact that they dismiss that Bitcoin is historically important. I think one of the reasons that they dismiss that Bitcoin is historically important because originally they were sort of sold a certain idea about it by certain proponents of it. And then that idea that they were sold turned out not to be true. And I think they made the mistake of attributing that experience to the technology itself, when in reality, that was actually a phenomenon of the people who were in the market at that time. And the Bitcoin software that TikTok next block produces, solves more transactions every 10 minutes, never did that to them, right? That's not something that you can pin Bitcoin on, right? So I think, start from this idea that it's just not a phenomenon, that it's not a historically important thing. And again, I would question them to defend that point, but again, I can only assume that they that's the standpoint they take because they've gone on to do other things, right? Where their work that just makes it obvious that they would have to believe that.
So a few more general questions here. There's obviously no known founder for Bitcoin outside of the pseudonymity of Satoshi Nakamoto. There's no founder to glorify, let alone vilify on the cover of Time magazine. No one to control the narrative. Has the pseudonymity of Bitcoin's founder been a PR issue for Bitcoin, do you think?
I think you can argue that different ways, right? I think people like to associate ideas with people, and we've done this historically. And I think that Satoshi's decision to be pseudonymous makes that very challenging, and that I think that is one of the I think it's hard to argue that Bitcoin hasn't struggled in its sort of like ability to communicate to the mainstream because it doesn't have that. In the way that I think you're alluding to Vitalik Buterin, the founder of Ethereum, being on the cover of Time magazine, and I think the illusion of something like that is like, oh, he's a Steve Jobs type figure, or someone who is now within the lineage of technological progress, someone worthy of paying attention to. Again, I think like this is a way that humans consume information, and it's once you realize it's just a lens, and that Satoshi sort of breaks that lens, but he does so on purpose. I think it's easy to see that it's different, but I mean, it's hard to argue that Bitcoin hasn't, it's needed other evangelists to communicate its message, right, over time, right? And I think the talking about Vitalik, I think is interesting, is because I think in some ways he is struggling with his own sort of relationship with the community. You see the community sort of moving away from sort of his viewpoints on some things, and him trying to change it. So he has, in contrast to Satoshi, sort of this active relationship with his community. And Satoshi is not, right? He's not there. We can only kind of go back to the old records to see what he might have thought about things. But in many ways, I think the beauty of that part of the system is that it does force other people to figure out how to move it forward, right? It does get to the idea that Bitcoin is a decentralized good, that it is a monetary system that we, the users, are now in control of and need to move forward. And I think that the world will take some time getting used to that process. But again, if you really want a decentralized monetary system, you have to have a system where there isn't a strong element of control. And Bitcoin has demonstrated consistently that it meets that criteria.
Last year, you stated that if the cyclical nature of the Bitcoin price deviates from its path, you would be less confident in Bitcoin. It certainly would have appeared to have done that. So where does your confidence stand now?
I don't believe that at all. I think it actually has been phenomenally cyclical. I think going into the last 2 years, it was very easy to predict that 2022 would be an up year for Bitcoin, which it was, and that 2021 would be an up year for Bitcoin, which it was. I think Bitcoin has definitely proven that it has a cyclical market. Again, I would struggle to understand how people would argue otherwise, because it does seem that every 4 years we do have these new all-time highs that are set by Bitcoin, and that there's recurring phenomena here where Bitcoin trades on the larger sentiment, where it goes through periods where, like right now, where people are obviously frustrated with Bitcoin, and we've lost kind of the retail crowd, and it seems to be going into more of a sideways period, right? And that's something that last year I also felt, right? So I had sort of had the prediction and said to everybody on the team here at Bitcoin Magazine that we needed to plan for 2022 to be a down or sideways year. So I don't really know where this comes from, because I think it comes from this idea, and I see this both with the people who are in the maximalist camp and the people who are not even in cryptocurrency. But they both may make the same mistake. Like, if you don't think the halving impacts Bitcoin, then you don't think the monetary policy of Bitcoin is important. And if you don't think that it's important that Bitcoin has a programmatic monetary policy, then why are you interested in Bitcoin at all? So I always see this as, Bitcoin will continue to be cyclical as long as it has a programmatic monetary policy, because humans will continue to plan around that monetary policy. So there'll be periods where smart people will allocate money to Bitcoin ahead of these changes in the protocol. And there will be periods where people come in after those changes expecting Bitcoin to appreciate in some way. I don't know. I think this idea that last year deviated is very strange to me. I mean, we definitely didn't see a parabolic move like we have in past Bitcoin markets, but that doesn't actually change the fact that over the 4 years between the cycles, there was a pretty similar price movement, like as this happened. So I don't know. I'm pretty staunchly in the Bitcoin is cyclical camp. I think that has to be true because I think if it's not true, then the monetary policy wouldn't impact Bitcoin. And so therefore, if you are actually questioning whether Bitcoin's monetary policy is important for Bitcoin, it seems like you're chipping away at a lot more of the structure there. You would actually have to be questioning some fundamental things about it. And because Bitcoin's monetary policy is programmatic, it allows for human coordination. So you'd expect for humans to coordinate around that monetary policy to their advantage, which they seem to be doing. So just for the record, staunchly in the Bitcoin is cyclical camp, and I'll go down with that ship.
No, I agree. I had asked a question as it related to the comments that you made last year, but it also attached to it a price target for better for worse. So I guess the asterisk there is then what would be a deviation from that?
Yeah, I think we would have to go through a prolonged period where the Bitcoin price was sort of trading sideways or was no longer responding to, the halvings, which are, the scheduled reductions in monetary issuance.
No, that makes sense.
And I'm not discounting that we could see such a thing. I'm just arguing that I don't believe we have seen such a thing. I mean, you could obviously argue that there wasn't a parabolic top last year, but I don't know if you really can say that because it went from $3,000 to like $6,100 in such a short amount of time. I mean, obviously, like the data isn't perfect, right? There's other things that happened. There was a global recession. Bitcoin like cratered down to like $3,000, where it probably wouldn't have otherwise without that. So there's all sorts of different factors here. I sort of dispute the idea that Bitcoin won't be somewhat cyclical, because it seems like if there's a middle point between Bitcoin going up forever and then Bitcoin going to zero, it's that it has to move between those points with some cyclicality and then also go up and to the right. So assuming those constraints, there has to be some cyclicality to the system. And I think, what do people use monetary policy for? They use it for coordination and allocation of resources. It seems like the Bitcoin monetary maximalists, their argument against the Fed largely is that people cannot allocate out capital correctly because the Fed is constantly changing rates and we're constantly sort of, wondering about the mystery of what the central party will do. Well, in Bitcoin, you don't have that. You have perfect knowledge of what the monetary policy will be and how it will operate. But then it seems like the argument for that is that the Bitcoin maximalists sort of make is because that people have perfect knowledge of it, that should be assimilated into the price, and therefore it shouldn't matter. I disagree with that because I think that takes the assumption that people really understand what the halving is and they actually understand the importance of it within the broader monetary system. And I actually think that is the part that is incorrect. They don't. And until they do that, people will continue to arbitrage the two systems advantageously. And that includes coordinating around Bitcoin to their economic advantage when there is an opportunity. And my bet is that those coordinations around the opportunity will continue to correspond to the halving. Whether or not that results in, certain price projections or not, I think that behavior will likely continue to occur. And then if it stops, I think we would have to ask some serious questions because it would be a deviation from the normal behavior.
The main reason that I wanted to have you on the podcast is your article, The Ethical Argument for Bitcoin Maximalism. And the reason is that I'm trying to make the case, as one of the objectives for this podcast, that Bitcoin offers certain rights that you very well describe in this paper, contrasted to other cryptocurrencies out there, let alone the current financial system. And so as center-left individuals, progressives, liberals, Democrats, whatever you want to call yourself, I think a common thread throughout that is the concern about traditional banking system and the marginalization that creates among society. Therefore, the rights that Bitcoin gives us, I would argue as good, and I would certainly believe that you are arguing as well. And so that's where I want to spend the remainder of our time is teasing that out for the audience.
Sure.
So if you wouldn't mind breaking down what you describe as the rights that Bitcoin grants its users, we can contrast that with other blockchains.
Yeah, well, I'll start by saying I think, definitely noticed or it's definitely obvious that the left, I think, has this focus on structures of power, right, within the United States government and, dismantling sort of the systematic effects of those structures of power, right, which is sort of why I've always sort of identified with that group. I think as it relates to Bitcoin, again, it can be tough to see how Bitcoin actively does that. It actually does require an understanding of both how Bitcoin differentiates itself from the fiat system and also how it differentiates itself from the cryptocurrency system. So one, I would start with sort of, a definition of like who the participants are in Bitcoin, and then sort of make the argument that the barrier to entry to those positions is one, both low, and then set by the market, right? So I think in order for Bitcoin to kind of perpetuate itself, you really have kind of three key actors, right? You have the nodes, the people who run the software, like who validate the transactions and actually, sort of follow and enforce the monetary system. You have the miners. These are the people who can compete, who use energy to compete for new Bitcoin issuance. And then, last but not least, you have the developers, right, who like propose changes to the code itself, right? So they're the people who are suggesting that, they will write improvements to Bitcoin or come up with new ways that Bitcoins can be used, and those will be accepted by the community, right? So essentially, all blockchains or cryptocurrencies have some union of these parties, and then Bitcoin, has a particular version of those. And so the argument that I would make for Bitcoin is that the barriers to entry for all of these parties in the system are not enforced by some central gatekeeper. So the argument would unfold something like this. If you want to become a developer in Bitcoin, there's nothing stopping you from being a developer for Bitcoin other than you acquiring that knowledge, achieving something within the meritocracy of other Bitcoin developers, and then ultimately convincing other Bitcoin users that they should use your code, right? So you can, I think, see from that simple explanation that there's no accreditation that you need for that. And the system is sort of regulated by the market for knowledge and competence, which exists sort of outside the system. On the mining side, so these are large companies that are buying custom machines and burning electricity in order to claim new Bitcoins that are issued by the protocol. There is no restrictions on how they do that, right? So the Bitcoin protocol does not require that a certain energy is burned in order to create or expended in order to create new Bitcoins. It doesn't require a certain geographical location. It doesn't describe it. They don't even need to use, the same equipment, right? You can use all sorts of different types of machines to mine Bitcoin. But here again, we sort of see that anyone who can produce energy can direct that energy to Bitcoin to solve blocks and then be issued new money from the protocol. So in this case, there's a couple of things that are set by the market. One, which is the price of the mining machines, and two, the price of electricity. But both of those things kind of occur naturally and outside Bitcoin. And anyone who finds a way to use electricity cheaply in order to mine Bitcoin profitably can do that, right? So whether you're using excess cow manure somewhere and you're processing that and dedicating that to Bitcoin, or using a volcano like is happening in El Salvador, anyone who has access to energy can do that. And there is no restriction on their access to that system. No one can tell you that you can't do that if you can meet the basic requirements of the system, which are scientifically imposed. And then last, there's the nodes, right? So there's the people who are running the software, so just average users. And your barrier to entry for that is that you buy a small machine or called a node, or you run a node on your computer or an old laptop, which just keeps a record of the blockchain, which is all the financial transactions, and enforces the rules of the monetary system, right? So, and miners are often nodes as well, and developers are also nodes, but everybody basically, your minimum requirement for the system is that you can just download the blockchain, enforce the rules of the system, and know with mathematical certainty that your Bitcoin is real, that these transactions that you're sending are real, that other people's transactions are real, and that no one has abused the rules of the system and printed more money or done any of these types of things. So again, a bit of a long-winded explanation, but I think what I was trying to get across here is that within the Bitcoin system, anyone can do all of these things. Your barrier to doing any of these things is set by the market. And specifically in the case of miners, it's the use of energy, right? Which is a separate market, but there's no gatekeeper there, right? If you're able to kind of follow these rules, you can do that, right? Simple contrast in the fiat system or the US government dollar system, or just the government dollar system, basically all of those things are impossible. If you wanted to audit our financial system, good luck. You'd have to call up multiple government agencies. Like, good luck getting an idea of how much money is in circulation. So your ability to kind of audit or ensure that the system is working correctly is not high. On the mining side, if you wanted to claim new US dollars that are entering circulation, good luck. Go start a bank, go apply at the regulatory agencies, go participate in the auctions for new money when money is printed, and then get in the business of, lending that money out to people. And if you want to propose changes to our monetary system, well, good luck. Get elected. Have $1 million that you can file for the presidency. Run on the election like Pierre Poilievre in Canada, and say that fiscal responsibility is part of your platform, and convince the majority of the United States to do that, and then go through the trouble of making changes to the monetary system through the political process, right? So I think again, sort of outlining these two things, you can see that one is enforced by math and it's enforced by rules. And the other system is enforced by a political process. And I think this is, maybe getting the subject of, your podcast. It's that, both sides of the political spectrum, I think, in our country have shown that they're abusing this political process for their own advantage. They're united in their abuse of this financial system for the gain of their own voters and the benefits of their own constituency. And I think to the extent that Bitcoin has become a more political movement in the United States, there's a shared recognition that the parties sort of share this behavioral activity, and people see Bitcoin kind of within the schism, as something that could bring that change, right? Because when, or if you envision a system where the average user, has the ability to check and balance everybody else, that is a system that maybe is in spirit more similar to what our government and founders wanted to achieve through democracy, which is, and again, I think the wonderful thing about America is we're a country that's encouraged to constantly question whether we're living up to our values. And so, I hope you found that explanation at least somewhat interesting, because I think it sort of gets at, all systems are made up of, multiple constituents. Just so happens to be the case of Bitcoin that because it is programmatic, software-based, and mathematical, your barrier to doing these things is low and up to your own desire for human achievement, whereas the other system is a product of a political apparatus that may not be something that you're currently happy with at the moment.
If I may, I want to actually read the rights that you've described previously that you believe Bitcoin grants its users. One is the irrevocable right to your money, the ability to write and review code. Two, the ability to post and validate transactions. Three, the right to a known money supply that will not change. And four, the right to dissent. You don't have to run certain upgrades to the protocol. You can run the original should you desire. I think that's very succinct, right? And I think a good way to contrast against not only the monetary and fiscal policies of the US government, but also other blockchains. So I'd like you to comment a little bit on how that does contrast to, say, the other popular blockchains like Ethereum. But I also want to touch on number 4, and the right to dissent. So first, what are your thoughts on how these rights, as you describe, contrast to, say, something like Ethereum?
Yeah, I presented that framework because I think it was really interesting, right? I think it's often unclear what the difference between Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are. And I think to the extent that people start evaluating that question, they do so from a certain lens, right? And that lens is highly shaped by certain factors that are actually, totally created outside of the realm of those softwares, right? So one of those things that I think really shapes that lens is the coin market cap kind of price, wall of price charts phenomenon, where, you have sort of each of these softwares is given like a fancy logo and a ticker symbol and then some sort of price, right? And I think it's really tempting to, on a surface level, to think that this is what makes these things different, that you can just pick the Dogecoin because you like dogs and the cat coin because you like cats. And that differential that you see on the surface is actually what differentiates those things. I think the overwhelming conclusion of people who have been in the industry is that is a fiction. That fiction exists to the detriment of consumers who are entering the space and is therefore wrong and unethical. And again, the attempt of this article was to sort of push that comparison. So if in the previous, analogy, I pushed the comparison of Bitcoin versus the fiat system or the government system because it's a bit easier, with the Bitcoin to cryptocurrency system, it gets a bit harder, right? Because you actually then have to sort of understand how these softwares operate. And to the extent that you join that software as a user who is both running it and owning a piece of the software by holding your money, in that software, you have to have a deeper understanding, right? So a surface level comparison that a lot of people will make is that in Bitcoin you can run a simple command with your software and you can validate the total money supply of Bitcoin, and know how much Bitcoin there will ever be, right? You just have a total guarantee to how the monetary system works. In Ethereum, which is another popular cryptocurrency, that is a very there's debate about whether you can do that at all, because essentially, it's so costs so much to run a node to actually download the entirety of the Ethereum system. And it costs, and there's actually disagreement among sort of the other kind of instances that have a whole copy of the Ethereum system as to how much money supply there is. And that money supply is increasing. So I think making that basic comparison, you could say the system in which you have more of a right to know the money supply and to know that that money supply is finite, that's likely going to be a system that advantages that user. Whereas the system that has the expanding money supply and in which the money supply, it's not clear what it is or how it's being validated, you could argue that that has a weaker a guarantee for the user, because the user in both instances, just wants to put their money into something that will hold value, right? So if you actually want to make an assessment of either situation, you would say that again, and that's not saying like one choice is bad, right? You may ultimately decide to make a choice to use some software, accepting that thing offers a weaker guarantee. I think what I was trying to pose with that article is that people are not doing that. They're not making sophisticated calculations. They're actually making decisions to their detriment because they don't understand, how these softwares work, right? So, taking another one, the right to review and run code, and then participate in changes to that code. Well, it is true in other cryptocurrencies that you can write and you can review the code. But if you were going to run, a node and audit that software, right, other cryptocurrencies make that prohibitive, right? So you as a user actually can't decide changes. And then there's, processes by which those changes are made, right? So that really gets us, I think, to point 4, which I think is really the biggest differentiator in Bitcoin, which is that you have the right to dissent, right? And I think this is something that's really, really powerful about Bitcoin, and that I was trying to articulate in that article, is that Bitcoin uses a specific set of tools to upgrade its software. And those specific sets of tools, are designed where developers introduce new ideas for the protocol. Those are accepted by the users who run nodes. But the users who do not accept those changes are not disenfranchised. They do not lose access to their money. If you're in a coma and you wake up in 6 years, it's highly likely that you'll be able to log on to your Bitcoin wallet and node, and your money will still be there. And in other cryptocurrencies, that is just simply not the case. They make decisions in ways that essentially mean that you have to go along with what the majority of the users want. And that if you don't, the consequences can be as severe as you having to keep your money in a whole different software, or that your software or your money might no longer have any value. And I think a lot of users don't really appreciate that is a choice, that is a process that they're engaging in, right? That they're engaging in a dynamic system that is changing, and that those changes can happen to their disadvantage. And I think, granted, we haven't seen too many instances where that has occurred. But my assumption is, I think, as we go farther along, especially with how ambitious some of these other cryptocurrencies are, that will occur. That and that will become a much more noticeable feature of the cryptocurrency non-Bitcoin system over time.
Well, let's hang on the dissent for just a little bit before I want to ask you about how you compare the current alternatives to Bitcoin as a recreation of the current financial system. But again, with regard to dissent, you've referred to that as when it actually occurs with other cryptocurrencies as pushing out minority groups who do dissent, as in like Ethereum Classic. But what does this dissent mean within Bitcoin, practically speaking? Do you see in the future that dissent could allow for new economies, so to speak, to be built on top of the protocol version that they want to run?
Yeah, this is interesting. I think this is like a very fertile and active area of debate around Bitcoin. And I've circulated this argument with a great many people who have different conclusions about it. So I will say that, where this argument comes from and sort of using this idea of the majority and the minority is that, In existing political systems, this is very clear, right? Whoever is in power is the majority, and usually who is the people who are not in power are the minority. And I think we know and have experienced that democracies operate in the case where the majority often can enforce their view and enforce their rules on the minority, and that this is part of the political process within democracies. I think in the United States, with the exception of things that are guaranteed constitutionally, right? And I think that's where the judicial system and the Congress sort of come into play, right? But again, I think you look at democratic systems as sort of having a majority, there's a minority. The majority is trying to sort of usually enforce some changes to the rules of the minority, but we have this check and balance, which is this constitution that sort of moderates, between the two. I think the other cryptocurrencies, they have some version of this type of system. So again, in Bitcoin, in order to change a consensus system like Bitcoin, you have to have greater than 50% of the users running the software who decide to make a change, right? So, and ironically, this change is actually indistinguishable from an attack on the chain, right? So this is a weird paradox of the software design where, again, just to give an example, like, if we wanted to, well, again, I think early on in cryptocurrency, again, these features were a bit hard to figure out, right? Like we didn't really know how to make changes to cryptocurrencies because there are consensus systems. Everyone has to agree on those changes. And so it results in some weird quirks, right? Bitcoin has pursued a path, again, where majorities can form and they can come to a conclusion that a certain feature is better, and then they can enact that feature, but they can't penalize people who don't enact that feature. And so this is a key distinction. It would be akin to saying, like, the United States could enact laws for its citizens that the majorities could enforce, but those laws could never disenfranchise someone. That person could never have less rights. They could only not have some benefit. And that's a really profound thing to actually sit and think about, because it sort of makes you wonder within our existing democratic system, well, how many things that the majorities want are actually taking away rights from people? Are they actually introducing some new feature that people can opt into, or are they actually taking away some person's right to something, right? So Bitcoin has kind of grappled with this, and I think early on there was a lot of substantive conversation about whether Bitcoin should be majority led, and Bitcoin ultimately made the decision that it wouldn't be majority led, that it would be consensus led. And I think, when you think about the lineage of governance, this is a new thing. We actually lack a good verbiage to describe it.
Please try to make the distinction there. I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah, it's very different, right? So a consensus system, right? And I think you can look up the definition of consensus. To make a decision by consensus means you almost need near universal agreement, right? And that's very different from a majority sort of government where you may only need over 50% of people to agree, right? So then you sort of ask yourself, how different would our political system be if 95% of people had to agree on something before it happens, right? You can sort of see a lot of these wedge issues of our time as things that sort of benefit from being something that you can impose with a majority of over 50%, right? I think you can think about, voting rights, like abortion, civil rights. There was a lot of things where, if you actually looked at how many people sort of agreed with the current consensus, it's not significantly above 50%, right? I actually think the United States government is fairly good at this. So I'll actually make a stump for democracy here, because I think when you look at something like marijuana laws in the United States, that's actually a good example of those laws have changed, but they've changed because consensus has changed, right? If you ask most people under 40, they broadly just believe that marijuana laws are outdated and they need to be changed, and they're generally pro-recreational, use of certain drugs, right? So I think the consensus has changed amongst people, and therefore laws have changed, but those laws really operate in somewhat of a majoritarian way. Oftentimes, in order to actually enforce something in these states, you need more than 50% of the people to agree with you. And in states where less than 50% of the people agree with that opinion, there hasn't been any legislative impact, right? So I think Bitcoin definitely tries to replicate the former consensus building, right? This idea that we can sort of reach a generational kind of understanding or universal understanding on something without the second apparatus, which is that majorities can form and then, enforce something on some minority. And because of that, it gets kind of again, it's a different system, and I think the other cryptocurrencies, they definitely skew towards the latter. They skew towards being majoritarian because effectively their arguments are, we have this ambitious roadmap to deliver all these features. We've published this roadmap for you to see. Therefore, we have your implied consent to make these changes. And therefore, as long as more than 50% of people agree to update the software, we are going to just invalidate everybody else because we operate on the assumption that you have already given us consent to do these things. And we are operating with your consent to do so. Therefore, you should have known and understand that. You should have read those terms of service. And if you don't like it, go see somewhere else, right? So they're not really tolerant to minority groups. And my argument would be that that makes them less useful as monies because essentially, if you are storing value in one of these other systems and you find yourself in a scenario where you don't agree with what the majority is doing, it is very likely that you will find yourself in a position where, the data, the cryptocurrency that you've determined to have value to you no longer holds value in the same way. So the technical mechanism, actually doesn't work for you as the end user, right? And I think, again, just sort of contrasting, in Bitcoin, that has not happened, right? We've never kind of made a technical decision that has done that. And there's a strong commitment of the community not to do that. So, you may see a lot of these other cryptocurrencies, they have, they tout these sort of advanced features and mechanisms, and they do have these things, but they often have come, at the expense of making changes to the software in a certain way. And Bitcoin, again, has prioritized this way of moving forward where, anyone who's running older versions of software, they can just continue to do so. If you don't like a specific change that Bitcoin has made, you can continue using the old software as if it's Bitcoin. I think one of the interesting theoretical part of this debate is, well, for how long can they use that? Does that software degrade in efficiency with the rest of the network? Those are some interesting questions. But I think right now what we have in Bitcoin is, there is the theoretical commitment to continue to respect minorities within the community who might not want certain things done with their money. To reject the idea that a mere majority is enough to invalidate those users. And again, I think the argument here is just that leads those users who use Bitcoin to have a stronger guarantee to their money. The other cryptocurrencies, to the extent that you are storing your money in there, you may have that money and maybe you're real. It may actually feel and look very similar to Bitcoin and have a lot of the same features, but you still are using, that money still exists in a system that may make decisions based on, one, this idea that you have prior consent to their roadmap, and then two, the idea that if you do not continue to follow that roadmap as determined by some majority, that you may no longer be able to participate in that system or else have to kind of go off on your own and create another system that's similar.
Well, we could certainly spend the rest of the podcast on that very question. But I do want to move on to getting you to extrapolate a little bit more on how you see the alternatives to Bitcoin, the other 15,000 plus tokens, recreating the current system of financialization. In my opinion, and I believe it is yours, that it's not necessarily a new novel technology that we should be flocking to per se, but rather, in essence, it's recreating the current financialization of what we already have. Like if you're trying to seek out a new system of money, the other tokens are not it. It's just the same financialization, but on a blockchain.
Yeah, I think there's multiple ways to answer that. I think the common framework is to look at Bitcoin as money and then to look at the cryptocurrencies broadly as some type of fintech or some sort of like startup type activity. I think that's a very strange framing. I have some problems with it. Or even to kind of narrowly view other cryptocurrencies as securities. I mean, I think it's very clear that Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are different. I don't dispute that they might be useful, in some way, right? So there might be specific things that they allow you to do at present that Bitcoin does not allow you to do. But to the extent that they rely on the creation of a new form of money or value to do that, I think that means that we should have kind of a higher amount of questioning about how those systems function. And I would argue the greater human pursuit is to continue to improve the Bitcoin software, right? Because it actually has those higher guarantees. And because there's no real limitations to the Bitcoin system, I think there's this idea that's really pushed by the alternative cryptocurrency community that Bitcoin is very limited and that it doesn't change and it can't change. And I think this is very dangerous because it's predicated on a lot of very strange assumptions that are what Bitcoiners would consider sort of high time preference, right? It's the idea that, oh, well, we need to be able to launch all these applications or smart contracts on Bitcoin. And because Bitcoin can't do that or is not doing that, we need to go make them somewhere else. And because we need to make them somewhere else, oh, we get to print some money and sell it to you. And the catch is that it's really that third thing that they want to do. They actually want to create some new form of value and sell it to you in order to justify the service. And in Bitcoin, there is an understanding that, we might not offer those service, right? So there does not exist an easy way right now in Bitcoin for you to, to run a software that connects you with other parties to do some type of decentralized lending, right? And I would say that it's very easy to say that this exists in the other cryptocurrencies. But it exists under certain conditions. One in which the other cryptocurrencies have sort of, issued or sold this new asset in order to operate the service. And then two, in which there's actually no reason that Bitcoin couldn't do that thing that you want. It's just that it doesn't do that thing right now because we need to be more careful about making changes with Bitcoin, and extending Bitcoin requires the care to not invalidate, all these other users and to continue building on the money. So you can sort of argue that to the extent that other cryptocurrencies compete against Bitcoin, they largely compete on time horizon, right? They offer some new feature that Bitcoin doesn't have now, but that Bitcoin might have later, and therefore you should use them. And I think that argument, again, is predicated on this assumption that Bitcoin can't or won't change. I think that's demonstrably inaccurate. If you look at how Bitcoin has progressed, it's become much more usable in a lot of different ways. But I think those are more fundamental, right? So you can, when I entered the industry in 2013, you were told to keep your Bitcoin on a paper wallet, which was basically just a QR code printed on a piece of paper. Now you have the ability to basically, have a multi-sig wallet, multiple hardware wallets that hold your keys across multiple geographies. We're getting to the point where, some of these setups are going to be more programmatic and trustless, through using Bitcoin. But, there's even mnemonic seed phrases, the idea that you can save your seed phrase in Bitcoin with 12 or 24 words. Like that was an actual invention that someone made, right? Like when Satoshi did not design that as part of the system. Or Lightning Network, right? The ability to move Bitcoin payments like around the world, in different ways without using the Bitcoin base layer. These are all dramatic changes to Bitcoin. And I think that the cryptocurrency sector, again, because it operates in a certain way under certain perceptions, it obfuscates how much change there has been because it introduces this like plethora of options, right? There's just sort of deluge of these other 18,000 cryptocurrencies. And so that does two things. It makes you, one, as an intellectual, sort of more skeptical of Bitcoin's progress, when really in reality you shouldn't be. And the other thing it does is it sort of, traps you into sort of convincing, well, there must be a use for all these other things because someone created them. And I would debate that point. I think some people within the Bitcoin community have done a good job about circulating like newer arguments for why that might be inaccurate, or there might be cases where we should support that. So Udi Wertheimer, who you might know on Twitter, I think has done a good job of this. I mean, his essential conjecture is that a startup that offers a Bitcoin service and that sells equity to private accredited investors is not different than a cryptocurrency that offers a service to Bitcoin users that sells tokens to the public. I think the verdict's out on that. I think the community is currently still debating that. But again, I think I would go back to the original question, which is if you think the Bitcoin is the best money, if you think it has the strongest guarantees for users, if you think that it's stronger than the existing financial system, even if you thought that the other cryptocurrencies were offering some service that Bitcoin can't, won't, should, or, would want to provide, the correct thing or the more moral thing, and this is why I think going back to what you said, the ethical argument, why is it an ethical argument? Because ethics is the study of human action and what is right. And I think the thing that you should want to do is you should want to extend that system that is going to work in the future, that is actually moving forward and advancing humanity in some way, which I would argue Bitcoin is, even if that means putting aside like the immediate gain that you might be able to profit from, this thing that provides the immediate advantage through some other means.
I think that's an important thing to touch on. And I would be lying if I didn't say that I've had that temptation over the past several years to YOLO into some other token. But as I've often said, I see Bitcoin as not only an investment from my standpoint and the privilege that I have, but also as philanthropy, knowing that it can augment the rest of the community and its users around the world. And for me to go in on something else for the hope of profits solely seems unethical.
Well, that's what I think. Like that, going back to structures of power and why the left I think should care about Bitcoin, right? Is because when a new dollar goes into Bitcoin and the value of Bitcoin rises, that simultaneously sort of benefits everyone in the system, right? Everyone gains equally from that. You could argue that in the other cryptocurrencies that's not the case because they're sort of founded on other founder groups that, oftentimes have nonprofit foundations, that oftentimes have investors, that often have, venture capital investors, that when a new dollar sort of goes into that side of the space, there's not the same collective benefit. The value accrual to the upside, sort of increase in that token's value is the same as a traditional startup. So the same way that we gave all of this power within our current democratic system to the channels of information distribution, like Facebook, like Google, et cetera, I think, to the extent that the left has a problem with how those structures of power have been enforced and who benefited from that structure of power, my argument to the left is that you should also be wary of these things again. The cryptocurrency market beyond Bitcoin does not have a solution to that imbalance problem. It actually, if you accept that other cryptocurrencies are essentially tech startups, which I think would be the best way to look at them, and knowing what you know about the last generation of tech startups and how they progressed and sort of, became adversarial to the interests of their users, my question would be, why would you want them to become monetary systems? Like, why would you actually want them to flourish? Because essentially, at that point, you are really open the doors up to, the same engines of Silicon Valley. And I think Jack Dorsey really does an excellent job of framing this, right? It's that, when he talks about Web3 and cryptocurrencies being the VCs are the problem. Right. So, again, if you believe that the current system, has been perverted by these mechanisms, that our democracy is suffering from, the network effects of these large corporations, again, I would encourage you to look at Bitcoin because you can arguably say that Bitcoin does not operate that way. Satoshi Nakamoto, the founder of Bitcoin, had no has no founding stake. There's no startup. There's no equity that he has in Bitcoin Corporation. To the extent that he owns Bitcoin, he got them through the same process that everyone else did of burning energy and then collecting the issuance of Bitcoin. And because of that, the value accrual in Bitcoin is fundamentally different, right? So again, to the extent that the left is interested in new structures of power, I think they should be really interested in Bitcoin because there just simply isn't a way to recreate what it created. And I think, again, there was a time where the other cryptocurrencies, probably had some justification in thinking, well, hey, what if we try these different ways? And I think that after seeing 10 years of experimentation, we can just clearly see that as a monetary system, Bitcoin has certain advantages that the other cryptocurrencies don't. And one of the reasons that they don't have these advantages is they can't get over this bootstrapping problem. It's just like, how would you reinvent money? Well, great question, but Bitcoin's already answered it. So why are we reevaluating it?
And that was going to be my second to last question, was if you had any additional thoughts on the progressive case for Bitcoin, but I think you nailed it there. So my last question then is, what gives you hope, Pete?
Well, I think my hope right now is, like, looking at the political landscape, is that I think there's tremendous opportunities for Bitcoin to disrupt the status quo, right? I think it's great to see that there are underprivileged and marginalized communities, especially the BIPOC, Bitcoin users who have really found Bitcoin and sort of see its value as something that's outside of the system that has, marginalized them and entrenched, their status within the monetary system, and it continues to exploit them. So I think that's really encouraging. I mean, I've been very encouraged by what's been going on with the mining, industry in the United States, particularly, one of the narratives that I think we put forward in the book that I helped author, Bitcoin and the American Dream, which is kind of focused on U.S. politics, is that, I think, again, like, all Americans should agree on certain things, right? And we should have certain kind of common goals. And I think one of the big fault lines over the last 50 years, if we look at the United States as a whole, is that we've really struggled to grapple with this question of what should you do, with the United States, economy post manufacturing, right? We've chosen to outsource manufacturing. We've chosen to benefit from cheap goods abroad, and that was a decision that was, despite the promises of many political leaders, continues to persist. And I think one of the interesting things I wrote in a recent Forbes article is if you look at the demographic of where Bitcoin is creating jobs in the United States right now, it is dramatically different from a Silicon Valley tech startup. These are jobs that are going to Ohio, they're going to Pennsylvania, they're going to Georgia, they're going to Texas. They're going to the kind of rural areas that have large old industrial infrastructure that are close to the electricity grid and have sources of power. And I think if I was someone on the left, right, or right, obviously, the right always plays well in the rural areas, but I think, we both should want, the rural economies of America to flourish, because I think one of the things that, has been broadly bad for us has been this consolidation of young people in the cities, the decimation of families, which, have, had to travel, and move away from these old centers, right? And we do have these like sort of old, proud American cities that, are sort of, could use an exciting industry. And I think the fact that Bitcoin potentially solves that to some extent by using that infrastructure and creating high tech jobs is tremendously fascinating. And I would hope that it would be something that both parties could support. And I think that's something where, if you're thinking about advancing sort of, arguments for why Bitcoin is bipartisan. I think it's bipartisan because of, if you think about how many other things in the United States that are political issues are both good for inner city Americans who have been marginalized and good for rural Americans who have been marginalized. The fact that Bitcoin is great for both, or it could possibly benefit both of those demographics, I would think would make it something that would be very hard to oppose, right? I do think we will see our political leaders try to oppose Bitcoin. But I mean, I think that the broad popular support behind it will make that difficult. So, look, I'm interested to see the U.S. political situation evolved. I mean, I'm optimistic despite, some of the, politicians who are coming in and, they're making big promises about Bitcoin. It'll be interesting to see what it gets done. But, if I'm looking at the U.S. political landscape right now in Bitcoin, I think I'm optimistic about where Bitcoin fits in because it seems to defy categorization, right? It's, small businesses have something to gain because, you have lower kind of fees. You don't have to use these old kind of, legacy processors anymore, especially you probably, start more startups in Bitcoin. There's more room for innovation. Rural Americans gain because mining offers, such a huge industry that could potentially boom over the next 10 years. Inner city Americans can benefit because, you can just go to an ATM now, drop in $20 and get out Bitcoin to your wallet without having to use any of these like kind of banks and legacy systems that, have exploited you. And I'm interested to see what the parties do for this, right? I mean, obviously, we live in a time when everything gets politicized. And, right now it seems like the right is turning on to Bitcoin. And my hope would be that the left realizes that it has just as much to gain.
I'm trying.
So if I could end with a question for you, I'd be curious, like what's your outlook on, Bitcoin in the 2024 election cycle? I know there's a lot of Francis Suarez at Bitcoin 2022 making a big appeal that the next president would be a Bitcoiner. What are your thoughts on that?
I fully expect to be interviewing a Democratic candidate on the podcast who is pro Bitcoin. I think it's inevitable that it's going to be a part of people's platform. I think the primaries coming up this year will be kind of a litmus test for that. And so if we see, Erica Rhodes do well and some of the other candidates, then I think it's inevitable that it's going to be a part of the platforms. And I just hope that there's going to be somebody from the Democratic side that will come out as a proponent as opposed to against it and then make it a partisan issue. But I'm hopeful given the fact that you are already seeing bipartisan support with the blockchain caucus, et cetera. So like you, I'm hopeful. And I think we just keep doing the work that we're doing and it should eventually get us there.
Well, appreciate your work and thanks for having me on. And, I appreciate there being more voices in the space that are a little bit more pro the left side. I am from Massachusetts, so you can't get too far away from your roots, I guess.
That's right. Well, in my opinion, you're the best journalist in the space. And so it was an honor to have you on the podcast. Please tell the listeners where they can find your work and the books that you helped work on as well.
Yeah, awesome. Follow me on Twitter at Pete_Rizzo_. Do daily posts on Bitcoin history, and so those are cool to follow and like. And you can also follow me on Bitcoin Magazine and Forbes, where I publish content. And yeah, new book on Amazon, Bitcoin and the American Dream, co-written with Jimmy Song, Lamar Wilson, Gary Leland, a bunch of other people in the space. Really was an interesting experience. 8 Bitcoiners in a house from different demographics talking about why the United States should embrace Bitcoin. Great read. Pick it up on Amazon.
Pete, thank you so much.